Hello everyone. It's great to be speaking to you today about the research that we're currently running on pre-driver theatre and workshop education. I'm leading this research as part of my doctoral studies at Cranfield University, where we're reviewing current practice and trialling a new approach in the UK. So the organisations that you can see at the top of your screen there, they have been supporting this research and making it possible, so big thanks to them. So in the 20 minutes that we have today, I'm going to go through with you the research programme outline, some interim findings and recommendations for action. So the intention as part of this presentation is to give you a better understanding of the research that's being conducted, but also hopefully give you some ideas to take away to your teams that are doing work in this particular area. So in way of background, we've been describing the overall purpose of the project is to find the best way to use pre-driver theatre and workshop education to improve young and novice driver safety. And more specifically, the project aim has been to evaluate whether the content and format of pre-driver theatre and workshop interventions can help pre-drivers to develop effective strategies for coping with road-related risk. So this whole area is a really interesting area of research. It's under-researched in an academic sense, and we've got some real implementation challenges that many people are grappling with in this area. So both of these reasons really warrant having a look at this work in more detail. So with regards to timescales, so this project is a 3.5-year project, and we've broken down the activity into 5 specific study areas. So right now we're focusing on study 1, which is very much looking at current performances and understanding kind of how things are working at the moment and how effective they are. So we've been doing this through a number of mechanisms. So I've been doing survey work with performances that ran in 2019 to 2020, an academic literature review, and as well as a content analysis. So I'm going to be talking about some of the work that's been going on as part of study 1 for the rest of the presentation. With regards to studies 2 and 3, this is very much about piloting a new workshop and a new theatre performance based on study 1 findings. And this will be taking place over next year. With regards to studies 4 and 5, so those will take place towards the end of next year, early 2022. This will be very much a cluster randomised control trial that we'll be delivering to really understand what is the effect of content and what is the effect of delivery mechanism for how we can achieve safer driving and safer activities for young people. So in the details of that diagram, you'll see some sample sizes, and this is very much how we're looking to run the trial to help give us the statistical reliability that we need to assess its effectiveness. Obviously, as most projects, we have been affected by COVID. We were hoping to run studies 2, 3, and 4 and 5 a year earlier, but we've now delayed that for a year. We're hoping to get back into schools to deliver that face-to-face, but we obviously have some contingency planning that we've done if we need to go online at a later date. So just to talk a little bit about study 1 and what we've been doing there. So right at the start of the project, which started back in September last year, we were engaging with practitioners at the start of the work to really understand, well, in particular, this question here of what are the practical and content elements of existing testimonial performance intervention programmes do you think is important for improving young driver safety? So we did this through 3 consensus building workshops, which we held in November and December last year. So that included 30 participants from 26 different fire and rescue services and local road safety partnerships. And so when we asked this question of what are the practical and content elements that you think are important with testimonial performances, we've got quite similar results from those 3 different sessions that were run. You can see there in a word cloud some of the things that were coming out quite strongly, but practically people said it was things like logistics and customer experience are important, making sure that there's resources and capacity to actually deliver programmes, and also the importance of relationship building with schools. Those are all things that were front of mind in their thoughts as we were considering this. And many of those practitioners told us the importance of engagement and reinforcing the approaches that are taken in those performances. With regards to content, lots of practitioners were telling us it's information about consequences that they felt was particularly important to get across, making sure that content was relevant and saying what was said and how was, you know, really crucial to how that content came across. So overall, this has been a really important process to understand delivery. So in order that we can develop something that obviously matches what we need academically, but also that is something that works for practitioners as well. Also, as part of study one, I've run a number of surveys. This was with some of the interventions that were running, particularly theatre provisions. So delivered a pre, post and 6 weeks. Essentially, we had around 900 intervention surveys come back and about 350 control. They've all been hard copy, or most of them been hard copies. So obviously we've been affected slightly by COVID in terms of getting those data entry in. So we haven't got the analysis of that yet. But I think the really key thing I wanted to mention here is that the surveys were developed using the theory of planned behaviour. So we essentially using a standardised question set and that have been tested with this target group in other areas beforehand. And I think this is really important because it enables us to link back the findings to the theory and helps improve our understanding of whether our interventions are having a real effect on people's intentions and then hopefully behaviours. As part of that survey, we also asked social groups, and there's some interesting work in public health looking at social networks and how we can use those to as implementation routes for some of our sort of health interventions. And as I say, the results haven't come back or the data's not back yet, but it'll be really interesting to see what those findings are starting to show us. And the final strand of study one has essentially been a pre-driver theatre content analysis that has been conducted. And a huge thanks to all the organisations listed here who provided the well, not essentially transcripts, but the audio recordings which transcripts have been developed from. So in total, we've had 7.5 hours of audio recording, which when transcribed has led to about 117 pages of transcript, which is around 70,000 words. So we've got some really deep data in this area to understand exactly what is the content that we're currently providing to young people in this pre-driver theatre education. So, as I'm sure many of you are aware, these are multi-agency partnerships with schools and colleges, which are happening across the UK and have done for many years. The content and format of the performances is essentially driven by local partnership requirements. But one of the key factors between all of them is that performances are looking to influence pre-driver attitudes and behaviours, and often they're doing it in a really hard-hitting and emotive way. Typically, performances will show video testimonials, live testimonials, as well as videos to support the messages that they're trying to make. And often, as you can see from some of the images on the screen, it's graphically showing the impact of young driver collisions. So the content analysis was conducted with 3 main aims in mind. So firstly, we wanted to get an understanding of what are the road safety risk factors for young people that are being talked about in the performances? And then what is the content and structure of the performances? How are they actually being delivered? And then finally, what are the behaviour change techniques that are being employed within the performances to get those messages across? So as I say, we had 6 performances that kindly provided data for this part of the study. 5 of these performances have been coded to date using the MVivo software program, essentially looking at coding up to content and the number of references. So the results I'm showing you today is based on those 5 performances. We have a further 6th one to add in due course. But as you can see from this pie chart here, when we look at what are the risk factors that are being presented across the performances, the largest number of references across the 5 were about speeding, followed by drink driving, non-seatbelt wearing, and then mobile phone use, which I suppose probably doesn't come as a big surprise to many of us, because these represent some of the fatal 5 issues that we know lots of these performances are aiming to tackle. So here's this data again in a count form, And as you can see here, that when we've got the standard deviations for how the averages differ across those 5 performances, you can see there's some small differences across, but you can largely see that there's quite a lot of consistency within the performances. When we look at that in terms of content, this is where there's more variability between the 5 different performances. There's a change there. You'll see that drinking comes up top, which shows actually one of the performances obviously really majored on that particular area of activity. But just in way of example, in thinking about some of the speeding content that comes across in the performances, so these have been categorized in this way, and this is across all those 5 performances. So talking about speed as a causal factor in collisions, the impact of speed on collision outcomes is also discussed, the consequences of speeding in its sort of broadest sense, as well as any anticipated regret people might feel if they did speed. These were all things that were discussed within the performances. And then there was some discussion around the reasons why people speed and the kind of the takeaway points, I guess, for the audience around speaking up against speeding, whether as a driver or passenger, and also the importance of self-ownership for safety and planning ahead. This came out in pretty much all of the performances, but in a sort of a different level and format. So the content and structure of the performances was also looked at. This is 2 of the 5 performances where I essentially tried to, in diagrammatic form, show how the performance was structured. And as you can see, even though there's differences in the way in which these things are delivered, there is some commonalities that come across as well. So the common factors being information about risk factors, collision examples, emergency services and victim testimony, and action to the audiences. So these were sort of key things that were coming across regardless of the performance and how it was specifically laid out. So then I broke this analysis down into 4 particular elements that each performance seemed to include. So the first really, and this was a very large one, was that all of the performances were structured around the description of collisions, and this did in many cases use a lot of fear appeal and graphic descriptions and images of crashes as part of that. And then related to that, information was provided about road risks and their consequences and the emotional consequences of collisions in particular, using sort of victims and family members to really emphasise that point. There was a large part of the performances that essentially focused on emergency service activity, so talking about their role as helpers, being knowledgeable about these collisions and why they happen, information about the emergency service job, and also the difficulties experienced by emergency services as they try and go about doing their job. And also, finally, I guess it was this point around self-ownership for road safety behaviours. So asking people to speak out and take action and develop skills and plans. So this was present in the performances, but I'd say it was to a much lesser extent than we saw in the other 3 that I've just spoken about. So I really wanted to, before moving on to the behaviour change techniques, address the issue of graphic descriptions of injury. So I had planned to share some quotes from the 5 performances, but actually I decided not to in the end, because some of these quotes is pretty horrific in terms of what is described. And I think one of the key things to take is that this sort of disclaimer is provided at the beginning of each sort of performance, and you can read it there, talking about letting the young people recognise and realise that they're going to be experiencing quite a challenging performance. That's within those delivering it. And across the 5 performances, there were 135 graphic descriptions of injury references. So that's anywhere between 3 to 22% of the overall performance content. So I've heard people discuss the importance of balancing drama and information, and largely having drama, which is described as in this way in terms of injury. It's essentially for the attention of the audience. So which is of course a laudable aim. We want to be able to keep an audience's attention, but I think the other thing to recognise is there are other ways in which to do it. You can activate people's attention through looking at social interaction, you can have discussion, and you can use humour. These are all ways in which on the issue at hand. And I think the important thing here really to bear in mind is that graphic descriptions have not been found to have an effect on the behaviours of young people at the end of the day. So there's a real question here for those emergency services that are using these graphic descriptions of injury to think about whether they're achieving the actual aims they're looking to do. So a number of performances are starting to move in a more positive direction, which we would think of in terms of the sort of behavioural side. This is a screenshot of a video that's played as part of the Learn to Live performance down in Devon and Cornwall, which I think is taken from My Red Thumb. And essentially it talks through or shows situations in which young people could address a driver at the wheel who wants to use their mobile phone. And it's done with a lot of humour, and it's got described in the way if you could take a pit stop, so encouraging the driver to stop off and to check their phone, then being the wingman, so essentially taking the phone off the driver and replying on their behalf, or simply things like the refusal of actually getting in the car with somebody that's an unsafe driver. So I think it really starts to put forward some ideas on how young people can react to these situations that they may well find themselves in. Of course, I'm not suggesting this is a perfect way to address it, but this is the sort of direction that the research evidence suggests we will be needing to take these sorts of interventions. So the final part of the content analysis was looking at behaviour change techniques, which are employed within the performance. So this was done using the 93 item taxonomy from Michi et al. And as you can see from both of these charts, the natural consequences BCT group really dominated the performances, both in terms of the number of references and the content. See from the standard deviations there that obviously there is some differences between the performances analysed, but even that being the case, you can see that it's so much higher than the rest of the BCTs that it really dominates the performance. So natural consequences essentially means information about health, social and environmental consequences, making consequences more salient, so kind of through pictures and videos, and focusing on things like anticipated regrets. So I think really what this is showing us is that we're currently over-focusing in one area at the exclusion of other behaviour change techniques. The analysis also looked at, well, what are these high potential behaviour change techniques that we can employ? This was using both Fiona Filand and Mark Solman's work done for the RAC Foundation back in 2017, and an analysis of, well, what is applicable to apply within a theatre and workshop environment. So here you can see the 22 high potential BCTs. Down the side, you can see a key showing whether they were present in the 5 performances or not, and if they were, to what extent. So I think one of the main things to take away from this is that we're obviously focusing on information about health consequences, probably to the exclusion of other high potential BCTs. Obviously, information about health consequences is a high potential BCT, and that's important to bear in mind. But we need to ask, how are we presenting this information, and is it in relation to what we find in best practice from health communication literature? So looking at existing research on pre-driver theatre interventions, what we know is that increasing awareness and knowledge of risk-taking behaviours has not been found to lead to lasting behaviour change. And this is in part due to the recognised intention behaviour gap. Current effectiveness of pre-driver interventions has been found to be weak, and this has been related to things like poor theoretical underpinning or design, lack of evaluation and short-term dosage effects. So one of the points that is made in Dr. Neil Kinnear's report for Scotland in terms of pre-driver education recently was that we need to move from raising awareness of consequences of young driver risks to actually developing the strategies and personal and social skills to cope with young drivers and passenger risk factors. So there's a real need to kind of move away from what we're doing at the moment, because we know that there's a number of pitfalls with what we're doing, and it's not in relation to what the evidence base is telling us. So I just wanted to end with some recommendations for action based on research. Firstly, some strategies and mechanisms for managing risks. So this is all about supporting safe passengers through things like communication skills, example strategies and coaching them on speaking up. It's also about supporting safe driver behaviours. So that's all of the above, but it's also around encouraging discussions within a social circle to talk about expectations of car use, using technology to support safe choices, and developing strategies for maintaining attention, especially in challenging road circumstances. So it's really working through how young people can keep themselves and others safe on the road. Second recommendation is really reducing performance risk and consequences content, because we need to provide more airtime for the content that address those other 22 high potential BCTs that I've just showed you. So probably the first step is to improve those areas where high potential BCT use is currently only weakly represented, and I've highlighted those particular areas there. And finally, if we are to provide information, we need to make it count, and I would suggest we need to signpost to safety promoting actions as part of that. So learning to drive, having young people come away with an expectation that they should be learning for 12 months, they should be getting a varied supervised practice up to 100 hours of supervised practice as well, and hazard perception training is ultimately important. Alongside that, we need to engage parents, particularly about that learning to drive process, which I've just mentioned, but also the value of what things like GDL could bring, and if there remains no legislation in place to support that, what they can do as parents to support safe driving for novice drivers. Things like zero alcohol limits, managing fatigue, thinking about the vehicle performance and choice of a vehicle, and also providing parents with managemental tools such as telematics and parenting agreements. How can we get people to use technology supports, whether it be telematics, reward programs, or downloading software, so soft blocking of mobile phone messages as they come in? And also, can we provide information about risks? So not the typical risks that we tend to provide, but actually things that young people could value from learning. So things around biology, around adolescent brain development, sleep requirements, and also legal considerations. So the research doesn't typically show that information provision affects behavioural outcomes to a very strong degree. But what you're doing here is signposting to other issues within the system that young people can take up and help keep themselves safe. So just to reiterate, those 3 points I'd like you to take away from the presentation really is that we need to focus on strategies and mechanisms for managing risk. We need to reduce our performance risk and consequences content, and we also need to make information provision counts, so signpost to safety promoting actions. Very much for listening. It's been great to talk to you about this program research. If you need to get in touch, there's our email details there. And also there's a link to the project site if you would like to have any further information. Thanks.